Just take a look around you for a second. The screen you're watching this on, the windows in your home, the very roads and cities we live in, they all share this one common and pretty much invisible ingredient. An ingredient so plentiful we literally named our deserts after it, and yet we are now somehow desperately running out of it. We're talking about sand. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds completely impossible, right? It's a paradox that just seems to defy common sense. On a planet with these vast, endless deserts, how could a sand shortage even be a real thing? Well, the answer to that question reveals a hidden and pretty unsettling truth about the foundation of our entire modern world. Alright, let's get into it and solve this mystery. The key lies in a simple but absolutely crucial detail about sand that most of us have never even thought about. And here it is, the big reveal. All that sand you picture in deserts like the Sahara, turns out it's almost completely useless for construction. Because when it comes to actually building our world, the type of sand is everything. If you were to look at them under a microscope, the difference is night and day. On the left, you've got desert sand. The wind has tumbled these grains for thousands of years, polishing them into these smooth, round little marbles. They just slide right past each other. But on the right, that's the good stuff. River and marine sand. It's been eroded by water, so its grains are all angular and sharp-edged. They walk together perfectly, and that's what creates the strong bonds we need for concrete, the literal glue that holds our modern world together. Okay, so now that we know we're after this specific angular sand, let's try to get our heads around the truly mind-boggling scale of our demand for it. And I mean, it is truly mind-boggling. Let's start small, with something we can all picture. A single, average family home. To build one, you need about 200 tons of sand. That's a lot, for sure, but trust me, we're just getting warmed up. Now let's zoom out to infrastructure. Just 1 kilometer of highway, that demands a staggering 30,000 tons of sand. Now think about the millions upon millions of kilometers of roads that crisscross our planet. Yeah, the numbers start to become almost impossible to comprehend. And if you need one statistic to really put this explosion in demand into perspective, here it is. The amount of construction the US did in an entire century, every dam, every bridge, every skyscraper, China surpassed that in just the last 2 decades. That rate of consumption is completely, utterly unprecedented in all of human history. But here's the thing, it's not just concrete. That screen you're looking at right now, it's made from melted down sand. The silicon chips that power our entire digital world, the fiber optic cables that are bringing you this very information, all from sand. We even use it to create brand new land out of the ocean. Countries like Singapore have literally expanded their nation's size by a quarter by dredging sand from the seafloor. So when you add it all up, we're pulling about 50 billion tons of sand and gravel from the Earth's rivers, coasts, and seabeds every single year. And honestly, that's probably a low estimate because so much of this extraction just happens off the books, completely unregulated. I mean, just let that sink in for a moment. Sand is the most used solid material on the planet. The only resource we consume more of is water. We use more sand than oil, more than coal, more than any other commodity that we think of as driving our world. Now, you can't have an appetite this insatiable without it coming at a cost. And it's a severe, often hidden cost that is paid by our environment and by communities all around the globe. See, when you dredge a riverbed, you're not just taking sand, you're ripping out the heart of an ecosystem. Riverbanks start to collapse, which can destabilize bridges. Along the coasts, when you remove sand, you erase the natural barriers that protect communities from storm surges. The sediment that gets kicked up drifts for miles, smothering and killing vibrant coral reefs. And in the most extreme cases, entire islands, particularly in nations like Indonesia, have been mined so aggressively that they have literally just vanished from the map. And, wherever you find massive demand and weak regulation, a dangerous and violent criminal underworld almost always emerges to control such a vital resource. They are known, quite simply, as the Sand Mafias. These are powerful, organized crime syndicates that run a multi-billion-dollar illegal trade in sand, and they often use extreme violence and intimidation to control their territory and silence anyone who gets in their way. And the economics behind it are just brutally simple and incredibly lucrative. A truckload of illegally mined sand might cost about $30 to extract, but in a booming city, that same truckload can sell for $200. With profit margins that are up there with the drug trade, it's really no surprise this has become such a violent and widespread enterprise. So as bad as this whole situation is right now, maybe the most alarming part is that it is on track to get dramatically worse. This crisis is accelerating. Just think about this for a second. Back in 1950, less than a third of all humans lived in cities. Today, it's over half of us. And by 2050, it's projected that 2/3 of all people on Earth will be urban dwellers. That's another 2.5 billion people who are going to need homes and offices and roads and all the infrastructure that goes with it. All of it built with sand. And this right here, this is the fundamental, unavoidable problem. The sand we rely on was created over geological time. We're talking millions of years of rocks being ground down by glaciers and rivers. And yet, we're consuming those millions of years of work on a timescale of mere decades. The math simply doesn't add up. The rivers cannot replenish the sand fast enough. The coastal reserves are being stripped bare. We are, quite literally, liquidating a finite natural inheritance in a single, frantic burst of global construction. Our entire civilization is this magnificent, complex structure, but it's built on a foundation we have always taken for granted. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what happens when that very foundation starts to wash away? Sand, it seems so humble, infinite, just an ordinary part of the background, but it's actually the hidden foundation of our entire modern world. And believe it or not, we are facing a crisis that most of us don't even know exists. Okay, let's really get into this. Think about every skyscraper, every bridge, every single road you've ever driven on. They're all built with concrete. And what's the most critical, irreplaceable ingredient in all that concrete? It's sand. It is quite literally the bedrock of our civilization. And it doesn't stop there, not by a long shot. Just look at any city skyline. What you're seeing are countless tons of sand that have been melted down at insane temperatures and totally transformed into the glass that defines modern architecture. Right, and get this, even the device you're watching this on right now, it only exists because of sand. It's the source of the high-purity silicon that forms the microscopic heart of every single computer chip. So sand didn't just build our cities, it literally built our digital future. But we're extracting this resource at a pace that it completely dwarfs nature's ability to replenish it. This incredible usefulness comes with a hidden price tag, one that we are only now just beginning to calculate. So the first thing you have to understand is that sand isn't just a simple local material anymore. That whole idea that you just build with whatever sand is nearby, that belongs to a totally different era, a bygone era. See, nations are waking up to a pretty sobering fact. They've been selling off a finite, strategic national asset. Countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, they've slammed on the brakes, imposing strict regulations or even outright bans on sand exports. They've realized that once their sand is gone, well, it's gone for good. And this is creating a massive shift in global power. This completely reframes how we have to think about global development. Huge projects, from China's continent-spanning Belt and Road Initiative to the explosive growth of Africa's megacities, they all depend on frankly incomprehensible amounts of sand. So if you control the supply, you suddenly hold some serious leverage over the future of global infrastructure. Now this new geopolitical pressure, this manufactured scarcity, it creates a vacuum. And you know what happens when legal trade gets choked off, right? A shadow economy, ruthless and incredibly efficient, rushes in to fill the void. Make no mistake, the illegal sand trade is a vast global machine. It operates with stunning sophistication. We're talking networks of informants, dredging entire rivers and coastlines under the cover of darkness, constantly changing routes to evade the authorities. This isn't some small-time petty theft. This is highly organized crime on a global scale. And that's the crucial point, the sheer scale of these operations. We're talking about industrial-sized dredging and mining, and it's often protected by deep-seated corruption, operating with total impunity where governments are weak. They are literally stealing entire landscapes. The economic and criminal fallout is just staggering, but even that is dwarfed by the environmental cost. We are racking up an ecological debt that will be incredibly, maybe even impossibly, difficult to repay. And here's the really bitter irony. We take sand to build and protect our cities, but in the process, we destroy their most vital natural defenses. We're removing the very beaches and sandbars that have evolved over millennia specifically to absorb storm surges and protect coastal communities. all while our climate is getting more and more volatile. And the consequences? They are measurable and they are shocking. In the last 80 years, the Mississippi Delta has lost nearly 5,000 square kilometers of land. To put that in perspective, that's an area larger than the state of Rhode Island, just gone. It's vanishing because of something called sediment disruption. Basically, dams way upstream trap the sand that would normally flow down and replenish the delta, while at the same time, mining operations scoop up what little is left. The delta is being starved. And this kicks off a cascade of disaster for the 500 million people who live on river deltas around the world. As the sand is removed and sediment gets trapped, the deltas sink and compact. Salt water from the ocean pushes further and further inland, poisoning freshwater aquifers and rendering some of the most fertile agricultural land on the planet completely useless. But this story, it isn't without hope. The sheer scale of this crisis is actually forcing innovation. All over the world, engineers, architects, and scientists are pioneering what you might call an architecture of restraint, and they're developing some truly incredible solutions. You know, maybe the most straightforward solution is just turning our old cities into the quarries for our new ones. When old buildings are demolished, we can actually crush that old concrete and use the material, it's called recycled aggregate, to replace virgin sand in new construction. In fact, some estimates suggest that this recycled aggregate could replace up to 30% of our total demand for natural sand. The main challenge isn't the technology, it's just economics and old habits. Right now, in a lot of places, it's still cheaper to just go dredge a riverbed illegally than it is to invest in the infrastructure for recycling. And beyond recycling, some people are asking an even more fundamental question: do we even need so much sand-based concrete at all? We're seeing the rise of mass timber skyscrapers, building materials literally grown from mycelium, that's the root network of fungi, concrete alternatives made from hemp, and even large-scale 3D printing that can create incredible structures while using way less material. Ultimately, this gets to the very heart of the matter. We aren't running out of sand in the literal sense. I mean, the world's deserts have more than we could ever use. No, what we're running out of is balance. We extract up to 50 billion tons of sand and gravel every single year. After water, it is the most consumed natural resource on the entire planet. The scale of it is it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. Now compare that industrial scale extraction with nature's replenishment rate. Every single one of those billions of tons of sand is the end product of thousands, sometimes millions of years of geology, of rock eroding and tumbling down rivers. We are consuming a geological inheritance in the span of a single human lifetime. And here's the most important point. We are not facing a crisis of capability. We know how to solve this. The technologies are already here, or they're emerging fast. The policies can be written. The only thing we truly lack is the collective will to recognize the true cost of sand and actually act on the solutions we already have in our hands. For centuries, we built our worlds on a resource we treated as if it were infinite, when in fact, it's irreplaceable. So the defining question for us now is whether we can build the next century not just from what we can take, but from what we choose to value and preserve. The choice? Well, the choice is ours. Let's talk about the one resource that truly powers civilization. It sustains every city, it feeds every single person on Earth. Without it, our modern world would literally collapse in a matter of days. And no, it's not oil, it's water. Yeah, our entire civilization is built on it, but that very foundation is starting to crack. All over the world, the wells that have sustained communities for generations, they're starting to run dry. You know, when you see those pictures of Earth from space, you see this beautiful blue planet. But that image creates an illusion of abundance. The reality is, 97% of that water is salt water, and most of what's left is locked away, frozen solid in ice caps and glaciers. So what does that leave us? This. Less than 1% of all the water on our planet is actually accessible fresh water. Think about that. That single tiny fraction is what 8 billion people depend on for survival. And our demand for that 1% is just accelerating. I mean, over the last century, it has absolutely exploded. We're talking a 6-fold increase. The gap between what we have and what we need is getting wider every single day. So where does the water we can actually use come from? And maybe more importantly, where is it all going? Well, the answer to both lies hidden right beneath our feet. You see, most of the world's accessible fresh water isn't in rivers or lakes. It's stored in these vast underground geological formations called aquifers. They're basically our planet's water savings account, built up over thousands and thousands of years. And we are draining those accounts at a truly alarming rate. We're pumping water out far faster than rainfall could ever hope to replenish it. In places like the American Great Plains and northern India, the ground is literally running out of water. And here's the permanent danger. We're not just using a resource, we're destroying the container. When you drain an aquifer too much, the ground compacts and the aquifer itself collapses. Its ability to store water in the future is lost forever. We aren't just emptying the tank, we're breaking it. So what's driving this huge demand? Well, the single biggest consumer, and it's not even close, is agriculture. It accounts for about 70% of all freshwater use, thanks to thirsty crops and the massive amounts of grain needed for livestock. The water embedded in our food and our clothing is just staggering. This is the hidden water footprint of your life. As if all that wasn't enough pressure, now we have to add climate change to the equation. And this isn't just about things getting warmer, it's about a fundamental disruption to the entire global water system. For all of human history, civilizations were built on predictable water cycles. You knew when the rains would come, when the snow would melt. That ancient predictability is breaking down. We are entering an era of, well, hydrological chaos, swinging violently between brutal droughts and devastating floods. The reliable rhythm of water has been replaced by extremes. A key part of that old predictable system was the mountain glaciers. They act as nature's water towers, storing winter snow and then releasing it slowly as meltwater during the dry summer months, feeding the great rivers of the world. And those water towers are melting fast. This creates a really dangerous illusion of abundance, a temporary surge of water in the rivers. But it's a false security. It's like liquidating a savings account. You get a temporary rush of cash, but you lose your long-term capital forever. So the crucial question then is this: what happens when the account is finally empty? Nearly 2 billion people in Asia depend on rivers fed by the Himalayan glaciers. The consequences of them disappearing are almost unimaginable. So, this combination of rising demand, a dwindling supply, and climate chaos, it's creating intense geopolitical pressure. And around the world, that pressure is starting to fracture international relations, creating brand new fault lines. Just take the Nile River. It's a textbook example of what happens when the needs of nations collide over a shared, finite resource. Here's the situation. Ethiopia, where most of the Nile's water originates, is building a massive dam for electricity and development. For Egypt, downstream, which depends on the Nile for almost all of its water, this is seen as an existential threat. And what's key here is that there aren't villains and heroes. These are legitimate national needs in direct competition. And this dynamic isn't unique to the Nile. Half a world away, a similar story is unfolding along the Mekong River, but this time with an even more profound power imbalance. China controls the headwaters and has built a series of huge dams. By controlling the flow, it effectively controls the lifeline for 60 million people downstream. Their food security, their livelihoods, are now subject to decisions made hundreds of miles away in another country. And this isn't just about distant rivers. Major global cities are already reaching the brink. The term Day Zero, the day the taps get shut off, is no longer hypothetical. It has been a terrifyingly close reality for millions in Cape Town, Chennai, and Sao Paulo. Now, let's be clear about something. History shows that nations rarely declare war explicitly over water. Instead, water acts as a silent threat multiplier. It aggravates existing tensions. But when food runs out, when economies falter, when the fundamental survival of a nation is perceived to be at stake, that is when water absolutely becomes a fault line for conflict. And that leaves us with the central challenge. We are all downstream in a globally connected system. Faced with this growing crisis, the path forward forks. Can cooperation through diplomacy and technology prevail over a zero-sum competition? Or will water, the very source of life, become the trigger for conflicts that define and destabilize the 21st century? That is the question we must now answer. You know, the most fundamental resource on our planet is, well, it's becoming a tool of power. And look, we're not just talking about environmental challenges here. We are talking about the geopolitics of thirst. and how that struggle for water is quietly but dramatically reshaping our world. Okay, so it all starts with a really simple, unchangeable fact of geography. And it's this: rivers don't respect the lines we draw on our maps. They just don't. Think about it. The Nile serves 11 nations, the Danube 10, the Ganges 4. These very systems that give us life are, by their very nature, shared. And this simple fact, it creates an inescapable dynamic of power, a fundamental inequality that's just baked right into the map of the world, because in almost every single one of those cases, someone lives upstream. And that single reality, the fact that one nation has control of the tap before the water ever reaches its neighbor, well, that is the foundation for the entire geopolitics of thirst. Alright, so this brings us to our first big idea, looking at water not just as something we need to live, but as a real instrument of national power, as strategic leverage. This quote from a Turkish official is, well, it's incredibly revealing. It just reframes the entire issue with such blunt clarity. Water from Turkish rivers belongs to Turkey, just as oil from Iraqi wells belongs to Iraq. Whoa, suddenly it's not about a shared resource, is it? It's about a sovereign asset. If you control the headwaters, you hold immense power over your downstream neighbors, in this case, Syria and Iraq. And this control is being put into practice on a scale that is just unprecedented. I mean, get this. China has built more than half of the entire world's large dams. A lot of those are on rivers that are the absolute lifeblood for countries in South and Southeast Asia. So you have to understand, these aren't just for generating power. They are powerful statements of control. There's actually a specific term for this whole dynamic. It's called Hydra Hegemony, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's when one nation's upstream position, combined with its superior infrastructure, dams and reservoirs, gives it decisive power over the country's downstream. It's a kind of influence that's always there, even if no one ever says a word about it. But look, this power dynamic, it isn't just about dams and rivers. It's much more subtle than that. In fact, it's hidden in the food you eat. It's a concept called virtual water. Think about it. When a country that's short on water imports a ton of wheat, it's not just importing food, it's importing the thousands of gallons of water it took to grow that wheat. And that creates this huge global web of interdependence, where a drought halfway across the world can literally cause food prices to go up right in your local supermarket. So, okay, what happens when this scarcity hits regions that are already fragile? Well, this is where water stress becomes what security experts call a threat multiplier. It's a fantastic term. It basically means it's something that takes a bad situation and makes it catastrophically worse. Syria is just a tragic, real-world case study of this. Starting around 2006, the country was hit by the worst drought in its modern history. And this wasn't some slow decline, no. Within just a few short years, the nation's entire agricultural heartland just utterly collapsed. The human cost was staggering, and it's so important to get the timeline right here. Before a single shot was fired in the Civil War, something like 1.5 million people, mostly farmers and their families, were forced off their land. They had to migrate to cities that were frankly already straining at the seams. So the crucial point here, and this is really important, is that the drought didn't cause the Syrian war. Of course not. That conflict had deep, complex political and social roots. But what the water crisis did was act as a powerful accelerant. It basically poured gasoline on an already smoldering fire. It created massive unemployment, fierce competition for resources, and deep social unrest right in the heart of the cities. And from this, you can see a clear chain reaction emerge, a kind of terrible domino effect. It starts with the water stress, the drought. That leads to a rural collapse, right? Agriculture fails. That triggers this mass migration into the cities, which just can't handle the influx. And all of that strain, it just fuels social unrest. And it amplifies every single pre-existing tension that was already bubbling under the surface. Okay, so all this talk of tension, instability, and strategic leverage, it naturally leads to one big question. But the answer, when you actually look at the history, is probably not what you're expecting. The big one. Will there be wars over water? I mean, for decades, we've seen headlines predicting exactly that. But is that what's really on the horizon? Just look at this. When researchers actually track all the interactions that happen over shared water basins, they find something pretty remarkable. It turns out that for every single instance of violent conflict, there are thousands of examples of cooperation. We're talking about treaties, joint management plans, data sharing agreements. Overt, all-out war fought primarily over water is actually incredibly rare in human history. And here is probably the ultimate example, the Indus Water Treaty. This thing governs water sharing between India and Pakistan, two nuclear-armed rivals, and it is held firm through 3 full-scale wars between them. So why? It's because both sides, even in the midst of conflict, recognize that the alternative, a war over water, is just mutually destructive. Nobody wins that. So the takeaway here isn't that water isn't a security threat, it absolutely is. The point is that the threat just looks different than we imagine. We should probably be less concerned about one single dramatic water war, and far more concerned about a future of 1,000 simmering crises. Things like state fragility, forced migration, and constant grinding diplomatic tension. It's a slow emergency. But this future isn't inevitable. It really isn't. There are clear pathways to a more secure water future. Now, none of them are simple and none of them are easy, but let's take a look at what's actually possible. The good news is we have a whole toolkit of solutions. Technologically, things like desalination are getting more and more efficient. In agriculture, which is where most of our fresh water goes, precision irrigation can slash consumption. Better infrastructure can stop the massive losses we see from simple leaks. And good governance, treaties and data sharing can build trust. The solutions are there. But yeah, each one comes with its own major challenges. Unsurprisingly, none of this comes cheap. Not at all. The price tag for achieving global water security is estimated to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars every single year. It's a truly staggering figure. But here's the most crucial point about the money. As expensive as taking action is, the cost of inaction is just astronomically higher. We're talking about failed agriculture, economic collapse, huge displaced populations, and widespread regional instability. So yeah, water security is expensive, but water insecurity, that's a price that no society can afford to pay. And this brings us to the ultimate truth of our water future. We can have all the amazing technology and all the money in the world, but neither one is enough on its own. The core challenge, the one single thing that will determine success or failure, is cooperation. You see, water forces us to recognize just how interdependent we all are. You simply can't secure your half of a river. It doesn't work that way. And in the end, we know there are no winners in a water war. So the real question that's going to define this century, it isn't about technology and it isn't about money, it's about us. Can we be wise enough to share the one thing that we all absolutely need to survive? We've all seen this picture, right? The future. It's electric. Clean, quiet cars gliding through our cities. It's a powerful vision, the one we've all been sold for a cleaner, more sustainable world. But what if that beautiful vision has a dark secret? What if the very foundation of this electric dream is, well, fragile, built on something hidden, something that comes at a terrible cost? That's what we're digging into today. We're pulling back the curtain on that hidden ingredient. It's a silvery blue metal called cobalt, and its story is complex and often incredibly dark. This is the cobalt curse. Okay, so to really get why cobalt is such a huge deal, we first have to understand why we need it so badly. It all boils down to the chemistry inside the lithium-ion batteries that power, well, everything. Our phones, our laptops, and especially our cars. Here's the deal. Cobalt is basically the battery's bodyguard. It acts as a stabilizer. Think of it like the rebar in concrete. It gives the battery's internal structure integrity. And this is absolutely critical because it keeps the battery from overheating, what engineers call thermal runaway, which is just a fancy way of saying it catches fire. On top of that, it also makes the battery last way, way longer. And that is why this matters so much, because the demand for this stuff is just exploding. Take a look at this. In 2015, the world bought about 500,000 electric vehicles. Fast forward to 2023, and that number is up to 14 million. And every single one of those cars has somewhere between 5 and 20 kilograms of cobalt inside. The scale is just staggering. Now, I know what you might be thinking. What about cobalt-free batteries? I've heard about those. And you're right, they do exist. But as Dr. Sarah Chen, a battery researcher, points out, it's just not that simple. For the kind of high-performance, long-range batteries that we all actually want in our cars, cobalt is still a key ingredient. So the industry's focus right now isn't to eliminate it, it's to reduce it. So think about that. Even if each new battery has a little less cobalt, we're making so many more batteries that the overall demand is just set to soar. The International Energy Agency projects it could increase 6-fold by 2040. 6 times. Which leads to the really big question, where on earth is all this cobalt gonna come from? So where does it all come from? The answer is both surprisingly simple and incredibly complicated. Geographically, almost all roads lead to one single nation. This chart tells you pretty much everything you need to know. A staggering 70% of all the world's cobalt comes from one country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. I mean, no one else is even in the same league. This creates a massive single point of failure for the entire global battery supply chain. It's an enormous risk. Now, within the DRC, cobalt is pulled from the ground in two totally different ways. On one side, you have these huge mechanized industrial mines. Think multinational corporations, big machinery, formal jobs. But on the other, you have what's called artisanal mining. And this is basically people with shovels and hand tools digging it out of the ground themselves. It's informal, it's unregulated, and it makes up a huge chunk of the country's total output, as much as 30%. And this is where it gets really messy. As analyst Mark Kabemba explains, it's not some clean divide. The cobalt from these two very different systems gets mixed together. It flows into the same supply chains, making it incredibly difficult, sometimes impossible, to trace where a specific batch of cobalt came from, or the conditions it was mined under. And that brings us to the real heart of this whole thing, the human price. Because when we talk about unregulated, informal mining, what we are really talking about is a profound human cost, a cost that is directly funding our clean energy transition. So, what is the real price of this silvery blue metal? It's not measured in dollars per ton. For hundreds of thousands of people, it's measured in their health, their safety, and sometimes their lives. This quote from Emmanuel Umpula, a man who used to work in these mines, just cuts right to the brutal reality. For so many people in one of the world's poorest nations, this isn't a job they choose. It's the only option they have to feed their families. It is desperation born from extreme poverty. And the risks they face are just horrific. Miners are digging tunnels by hand with no structural support, so collapses are frequent. They're breathing in toxic dust day in and day out with no protective gear. The local water and soil become contaminated. And maybe most disturbing of all, countless investigations have documented the persistent, heartbreaking problem of child labor. So this is the difficult truth we're left with. We are trying to solve one enormous problem, climate change, by relying on a system that is creating another set of devastating problems half a world away. It's the green paradox. Dr. Sarah Chen puts it perfectly. She says this is the paradox we face. Our quest for clean vehicles in our cities is directly linked to environmental damage and human suffering in communities that have the least power to demand any kind of change. Look, the point here isn't to stop the transition to clean energy. That technology is crucial for our planet's future. But we have to confront this question head on. How do we pursue that future responsibly? How do we build a clean future for ourselves without leaving a trail of suffering in its wake? Let's talk about cobalt. It's this sort of hidden ingredient that's absolutely essential for the electric vehicle revolution, the one that promises us all a cleaner future. But the story of this mineral, well, it's not just about green tech. It's a story about power, about profit, and a really deep ethical paradox that makes you question the whole idea of a clean transition. And it all starts with this one number, 70%. Think about that. When almost 3/4 of a resource this critical to the global economy is locked up in one place, it creates this incredible vulnerability. It's a weak link that sends ripples through everything, all the way from a mine in the DRC to the EV in your neighbor's driveway. And because of that massive concentration, cobalt stops being just a simple metal. It becomes a piece on the global chessboard, something that literally shapes international politics and even national security. Yeah, governments have a special name for materials like cobalt, strategic minerals, and there's a good reason for that. They're so vital for our technology, for our economies, that losing access to them isn't just an inconvenience. No, it's a direct threat to a country's security and its future. A former trade official, Ambassador David Weber, put it perfectly. He said when 70% of a critical input comes from one country, any of these scenarios would ripple through global manufacturing. And that disruption, it could be anything. Political turmoil, a natural disaster, or a deliberate move to restrict trade. The point is, the dependency itself is the danger. So, you'd think that sitting on all this mineral wealth would be a huge blessing for the DRC, right? But so often it's the exact opposite. It's a phenomenon economists call the resource curse. All that incredible wealth from cobalt, it doesn't flow down to the people. Instead, it can actually fuel corruption and conflict. You end up with communities living on top of billions of dollars of wealth, but they still don't have basics like clean water or reliable electricity. It's a tragic paradox. And to make it even more complicated, the power dynamic isn't straightforward. See, the DRC has the raw ore in the ground, but China has spent years dominating the next absolutely crucial step, refining that ore into the high-purity battery-grade material everyone needs. This creates this tangled web of interdependence between countries and massive corporations. So all of this pressure, it starts to shift on to the big corporations. Now the tech giants, the huge automakers, everyone is looking at them and asking, can you guarantee that your supply chain is clean, that it's ethical? But what does a promise like that even mean in the real world? On paper, it all looks great. You see these corporate pledges with all the right buzzwords. Zero tolerance for child labor, safe working conditions, full transparency. They've all got these sweeping ESG, environmental, social, governance policies. But actually delivering on those promises, that's a whole other story. Here's why it's so hard. A supply chain auditor named Rachel Owens explained it this way. She says, trying to trace cobalt from a finished car battery all the way back to one specific mine is just incredibly difficult. And the moment cobalt from small, informal mines gets mixed in with the rest, the trail just goes cold. It's almost impossible to verify where it came from. You see, it's like there are two totally separate worlds of cobalt mining existing side by side. On one side, you have these huge industrial mines. They're high-tech, they're legally recognized, and you can audit them. But on the other side, you have this massive, informal network of what are called artisanal miners, people digging by hand. And it's in this second, untraceable economy where the worst problems happen. And this leads to a really tough ethical question. If you're a big company, and you just say, okay, we're not buying any cobalt that might come from an artisanal mine, have you solved the problem? Or have you just cut off the only source of income for hundreds of thousands of people, pushing them deeper into the shadows and into the arms of buyers who care even less about safety or ethics? This is where the story takes a turn. When you're faced with a human problem this tangled, a lot of people start looking for a way out through technology. Is there some kind of engineering magic bullet? Can we innovate our way out of this mess? Well, one of the biggest hopes is the rise of cobalt-free batteries. The most common one is called lithium iron phosphate, or LFP. Now, as you can see, there's a trade-off. With LFP, you get a cheaper, safer battery and, most importantly, zero cobalt. The downside, you get a little less energy density, which for an EV means a slightly shorter range. But for many standard range cars, it's a trade-off automakers are now willing to make. The other huge technological solution on the horizon is recycling. I mean, the logic is simple. As the first wave of electric cars starts to get old, we'll have this growing mountain of used batteries. The idea is to collect them, process them, and pull out over 90% of those valuable metals, like cobalt and nickel, to put right back into new batteries. That creates a circular economy, and over time, it could dramatically reduce how much new mining we need to do. But, and this is a big but, here's the reality check. Technology isn't a magic switch you can just flip. The demand for EVs is absolutely exploding right now. It's growing way faster than old batteries are becoming available to recycle. So for the next few decades at least, we are still going to need to dig new cobalt out of the ground. There's just no way around it. And that brings us right back to the very heart of this whole thing. The story of cobalt forces us all to ask a really uncomfortable question about what the true price of our green future really is. It really boils down to this fundamental tension. Is the desperate, urgent need to fight climate change more important than the pursuit of justice for the people and places that are providing the materials to do it? The debate here is pretty stark. You have one side arguing, look, the global catastrophe of unchecked climate change is so enormous that these difficult, sometimes tragic, trade-offs in mining are a price we have to pay. We just can't wait. But then the other side comes back and says, a green future that's built on a foundation of human exploitation isn't green at all. You're just swapping one kind of disaster for another. So what would a real solution, a just transition, actually look like? Well, it wouldn't be just one thing. It would have to be this complex, multi-layered approach. You'd have to formalize and support those mining communities, not abandon them. You need to fight corruption, invest in new technologies, and go all in on building that recycling system. It's a complicated answer for a deeply complicated problem. You know, in the end, after you look at all the geopolitics, the corporate reports, and the technology, It all comes down to a very human reality. This question from a Congolese miner says it all. When people in rich countries buy their electric cars, do they think about where the materials come from? Do they think about us? It just cuts right through everything and asks us to really see the full price tag. Make no mistake, the transition to an electric future is happening. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how. So the real choice in front of us is about what values will define this new era. Are we going to build a future that just moves the burden from one place to another? Or are we going to build one that is both green and just? That's the choice we have to make.